The wind tore across Carter's failing farm like a fury unleashed, rattling the loose boards on the barn and whipping rain against the windows in sheets so thick he could barely see past the porch. November in rural Kentucky could be brutal, but this storm felt personal, like nature itself wanted to finish what poverty had started. Carter stood in the kitchen of the old farmhouse, staring at the single can of soup that would be dinner for the third night running. 42 years old, weathered hands wrapped around a mug of reheated coffee, he looked a decade older. The foreclosure notice sat on the table, giving him 30 days. 30 days to come up with money he didn't have, to save a farm that hadn't turned a profit in 3 years. The barn roof had partially collapsed last spring. He'd patched it with salvaged tin and prayer, but it wouldn't hold anything heavier than hay. The tractor had been sold 2 months ago. The last of the cattle went in August. Now it was just Carter, this dying house that had belonged to his grandfather, and about 100 acres of exhausted soil that nobody wanted to buy. Thunder crashed so loud it shook the foundation. Then, through the roar of rain, he heard something else. A sound that made no sense. The deep, rattling whinny of a horse, close to the house. Too close. Carter grabbed his coat and the heavy flashlight, pushing out onto the porch. The beam caught them immediately, and he froze. A massive draft horse stood in his front yard, water streaming off its broad back. It had to be a Shire or Clydesdale, easily 18 hands high, with feathered hooves the size of dinner plates. Behind it, pressed against its flanks, 2 foals huddled and shook, their coats plastered dark with rain. They couldn't have been more than a few months old. Jesus, Carter breathed. Where the hell had they come from? The big horse took a step toward the porch, its eyes reflecting the flashlight beam. It whinnied again, a sound of pure distress, and the foals stumbled behind it. They were shivering violently. Carter's mind raced. The barn wasn't an option. The roof would come down on them in this wind. His nearest neighbor was 4 miles away, and his truck had a quarter tank of gas he was saving for emergencies. These animals would die of exposure if he left them out here. The horse took another step. It was looking directly at him, water pouring off its massive head, waiting. "This is insane," Carter muttered, but he was already moving, already throwing open the front door. "Come on then, come on!" The big horse didn't hesitate. It walked straight up the porch steps, those old boards groaning under a ton of living muscle, and into Carter's house. The foals followed, their small hooves clattering on the wooden floor. Carter stood in his own doorway, soaked to the bone, watching 3 horses occupy his living room. The big one lowered its head, sniffing at the threadbare rug. One foal pressed against the wall near the fireplace. The other stood trembling in the center of the room, eyes wide with fear. "What the hell have I done?" Carter whispered. He spent the next hour drying them off with every towel he owned, building up the fire, spreading out old blankets. The horses calmed gradually. The big one stood remarkably still, as if understanding that this fragile human shelter couldn't take much abuse. The foals eventually lay down, exhausted. Carter made his soup, eating it cold, because he didn't want to leave the room. He sat in his grandfather's chair, watching these impossible houseguests, wondering whose animals they were and how much trouble he'd just invited into his life. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, against all reason, 3 horses slept in a poor farmer's living room. Carter woke to silence, the profound quiet that follows a storm. Grey dawn light filtered through the windows. His back ached from sleeping in the chair, but that discomfort vanished the moment he remembered why. The horses were still there. The big draft stood near the far wall, its head lowered. The foals were awake, nosing around the room with the cautious curiosity of young animals in a strange place. Carter stood slowly, his joints protesting. "Morning," he said absurdly, then laughed at himself. He needed to figure out where these animals belonged. Someone had to be looking for them. He moved toward the kitchen to make coffee, but stopped. Something was off about the room. The old rug had been pushed aside, revealing the original floorboards underneath. There were fresh scratches in the wood, marks from hooves, but concentrated in specific areas, as if the big horse had been searching for something. Carter frowned, moving closer. The scratches formed a pattern near the east wall, the oldest part of the house. That wall dated back to when his great-grandfather had built the original structure in 1887. His grandfather had added onto it over the years, but that wall remained, thick planks of old-growth oak that didn't exist anymore. The draft horse swung its massive head toward him, then back to the wall. It pawed once, deliberately at a specific board. "What are you doing, boy?" Carter approached carefully. The horse didn't shy away. Instead, it lowered its nose to the baseboard, snorting. The foals moved closer too, pressing against that same wall. Carter knelt down. The floorboards here felt slightly different under his hand, cooler, as if there was an air gap behind them. He'd lived in this house his whole life and never noticed. The wall looked solid, but when he pressed his palm against it, he felt the faintest give. His heart started beating faster. He'd heard stories, everyone in rural Kentucky had, about houses from the 1800s having hidden compartments, places where people hid valuables during the Civil War or stashed cash during the Depression. But those were just stories, weren't they? Carter stood up, looking at the wall with new eyes. The big horse watched him, then pawed again at that same spot. The animal's behavior made sense now. Horses had incredible senses of smell. It was probably detecting old wood rot or mice or some kind of moisture damage he needed to fix anyway. But the scratch marks weren't random. They were concentrated in one specific section, about 3 feet off the ground, right where the baseboard met the wall. Carter went to the kitchen and retrieved the only tool he had left, a crowbar he'd used to pry boards off the barn. His hands were shaking slightly as he returned to the wall. "If there's nothing there," he told the horse, "I'm the one who looks crazy, not you." He wedged the crowbar behind the baseboard and pulled. The wood resisted, then gave with a crack that made him wince. But the board came away cleanly, revealing the space behind the wall. And there, in the gap between the old studs, something sat, wrapped in oil-stained canvas. Carter's breath caught. His fingers trembled as he reached in and pulled out the bundle. It was heavier than he expected, about the size of a shoebox. The canvas was old, maybe decades old, tied with cord that crumbled when he touched it. He carried it to the table, the big horse following him with its eyes. The foals pressed closer, watching with animal intensity. Carter unwrapped the canvas slowly. Inside was a metal box, its surface dark with age but intact. There was no lock, just a simple clasp. He opened it. Money, stacks of old bills bound with rubber bands that had long since perished. But beneath the cash, which he could already tell was old currency, probably worthless, there were papers, documents. Carter pulled out the first one and unfolded it carefully. It was a deed. A land deed, dated 1889, for property in what was now downtown Louisville. 300 acres, signed over to Marcus Webb, his great-grandfather's name. His hands shook harder. Louisville property from 1889. That would be worth... He didn't let himself think it. He kept reading. There were more documents, more deeds, stock certificates from companies he'd never heard of. A handwritten letter explaining that Marcus Webb had sold his cattle at extraordinary profit in 1888, invested in Louisville land before the city's boom, and hidden these documents when he fell ill, intending to tell his son, but dying before he could. The letter ended. "For my blood, for the farm, don't let them take it." Carter sat down hard in his grandfather's chair. Outside, the morning sun was breaking through the clouds. Inside, 3 horses stood in his living room, and his entire world had just shifted on its axis. By noon, Carter had made 3 phone calls that changed everything. The first was to a property attorney in Louisville named Ava Morrison, whose number he found online. She'd listened to his story with professional skepticism until he started reading the deed numbers and dates. Then her tone changed completely. "Mr. Webb, don't touch those documents any more than you already have. Don't tell anyone else about this. I'm coming out there this afternoon." The second call was to the local veterinarian, Doc Riley Patterson, asking him to come check out the horses and help identify their owner. Riley had been a year ahead of Carter in high school, back when Carter's future looked different. "3 horses just walked into your house during the storm," Riley had said. "Carter, you been drinking? Just come look at them, will you?" The third call was one he didn't make but received. His phone rang at 12:47 p.m., a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Webb, this is Logan Pritchard. I represent the Pritchard Land Development Corporation. I understand you've come into possession of certain historical documents." Carter felt his stomach drop. "How the hell do you know about that?" "Small towns talk, Mr. Webb. Mrs. Morrison's secretary happens to golf with my assistant. Now, those documents you found, they're historically significant, certainly, but their legal status is complicated, very complicated. I'd like to make you an offer that would save us all a great deal of expensive litigation. I haven't even had them verified yet. $50,000, cash, today, for the documents and your agreement not to pursue any claims based on them." Carter's throat went dry. $50,000 would save the farm, pay off the foreclosure, buy him time, but something in Pritchard's voice, the urgency beneath the professional smoothness, made him hesitate. "I need to think about it." "Mr. Webb, I'm trying to help you. Those documents belong to your great-grandfather, yes, but the legal chain of ownership is murky. The statute of limitations on property claims, the question of whether those deeds were ever properly recorded, whether the original sales were even valid, it could take years in court. Years you don't have, from what I understand about your financial situation." How did he know about the foreclosure? Carter felt anger rising through his confusion. "I'll call you back," he said, and hung up. Ava Morrison arrived at 2 p.m. in a silver BMW that looked wildly out of place on his dirt driveway. She was in her mid-30s, dressed in a sharp suit, carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than Carter's truck. But when she stepped into his house and saw the horses, she stopped dead. "You weren't kidding about them being in here." "This is the least weird part of my day," Carter said. He showed her the documents. She pulled out a jeweler's loupe and examined the paper, the ink, the signatures. Her expression grew more intense with each page. "Mr. Webb," she finally said, "if these are authentic, and I believe they are, you're looking at property holdings that would be worth, conservatively, $15 to $20 million in current value." The number hit Carter like a physical blow. He sat down. The big horse, standing near the wall where it had spent most of the day, turned its head to look at him. "That's assuming the deeds are still valid," Ava continued, "and that's a significant assumption. But I pulled records on my drive out here. The properties listed here were never sold or developed. They're currently owned by something called the Louisville Heritage Trust, which," she checked her phone, "is a subsidiary of Pritchard Land Development." "Pritchard just called me," Carter said, "offered me $50,000 to walk away." Ava's expression hardened. "He offered you $50,000 for property worth millions. That tells me he knows these deeds are valid, and he knows his company's ownership claim is fraudulent. So what do? You fight. This will get ugly, Mr. Webb. Pritchard has lawyers, money, political connections, but you have the original documents and the law on your side. The question is whether you're prepared for what's coming." Carter looked around his shabby living room, at the foreclosure notice still on the table, at the 3 horses that had somehow brought him to this impossible moment. "I've got nothing left to lose," he said. "Let's fight." The next 72 hours felt like falling down a rabbit hole into a world Carter didn't recognize. Ava filed a formal claim with the Kentucky property courts, asserting Carter's ownership of the Louisville properties based on the 1889 deeds. Within hours, Pritchard Development responded with a motion to dismiss, arguing the documents were forgeries, that the statute of limitations had expired, and that Carter was attempting fraud. The local newspaper picked up the story. Poor farmer claims multi-million-dollar Louisville property. By morning, there were 3 news vans in Carter's driveway. Doc Riley had come by to check the horses and confirmed they were in good health, but had no brands, microchips, or identifying marks. No one had reported them missing. It was as if they'd materialized from nowhere, though Riley's professional opinion was that someone had probably abandoned them during the storm, hoping they'd find shelter. "Happens more than you'd think," Riley said. "Economy's bad. People can't afford to feed large animals, so they just let them go. It's cruel, but it's reality." Carter had moved them to the patched barn, despite his concerns. The big horse, he'd started calling him Marcus after his great-grandfather, seemed calm enough. The foals, which Riley estimated at about 4 months old, stayed close to Marcus like he was their father, though Riley said they were probably just bonded to him after whatever trauma had led to their abandonment. On the second day, things escalated. Carter was in the barn with the horses when a black Escalade pulled up. Logan Pritchard himself stepped out, flanked by 2 men in suits. Pritchard was in his 50s, silver-haired, with the kind of tan that came from golf courses and the confidence that came from never hearing no. He walked into the barn without invitation. "Mr. Webb, I think we got off on the wrong foot." Carter kept brushing Marcus's coat. That's one way to put it. "I'll be direct. My family has managed that Louisville property for 3 generations. We've paid taxes on it, maintained it, planned development around it. Your great-grandfather sold that land in 1891. We have records of the sale. These documents you found are either forgeries or they're obsolete. Either way, pursuing this claim will bankrupt you in legal fees before you see a dime." "Your records are wrong," Carter said quietly, "or they're lies." Pritchard's smile didn't waver. "I'm prepared to offer you $200,000. Final offer. You sign over any claim to those properties, and you walk away with enough money to save this farm and start over. Otherwise," he looked around the barn with visible disdain, "otherwise you're going to lose everything anyway, and you'll have nothing to show for it." Carter set down the brush. Marcus shifted, his massive bulk moving between Carter and the visitors, not aggressively, just protectively. "Mr. Pritchard, I spent my whole life watching this farm die. Watching my family's legacy turn to dust because we didn't have money, didn't have options, didn't have hope. That land was stolen from my great-grandfather, maybe through fraud, maybe through intimidation, I don't know. But those documents say it belongs to me, and I'm not selling my family's legacy for a fraction of what it's worth, not again." "You're making a mistake." "Then I'll make it, but I'll make it standing up." Pritchard's expression went cold. "You should know that I've filed a complaint with the State Historical Board claiming those documents were removed from a historical site illegally. I've also contacted the IRS about potential tax implications of found assets. And I've retained a forensic examiner who will testify that those documents are forgeries created to defraud my company." He turned to leave, then paused. "You're a good man, Webb. I can see that. But good men lose to people like me every single day. Think about that." After they left, Carter stood alone in the barn with the horses. His hands were shaking. Marcus lowered his great head and breathed warm air against Carter's shoulder, a simple animal gesture of presence. "I hope I'm doing the right thing," Carter whispered. That evening, Ava called with worse news. Pritchard's filed for an emergency restraining order preventing you from claiming or accessing the Louisville properties. He's also demanding the original documents be turned over to the court for authentication, which means they'll be out of your possession in a system he has influence over. Can he do that? He can try. We have a hearing tomorrow morning in Louisville. Carter, I need to be honest with you. Pritchard has Judge Hendricks, and Hendricks is known for favoring development interests. This could go badly. What's the alternative? Take the 200,000. Live to fight another day. Carter looked out the window at the barn, at Marcus's dark shape visible through the door, an abandoned horse that had somehow known exactly where to go during a storm, exactly where to search in a house full of walls. No, he said. We go to court. The Louisville courthouse was intimidating, all marble and authority, designed to make people like Carter feel small. He sat next to Ava at the plaintiff's table, wearing the only suit he owned, 20 years old and smelling of mothballs. Across the aisle, Logan Pritchard sat with 4 attorneys, projecting the confidence of someone who'd never lost. Judge Hendricks was a heavy-set man in his 60s, with the tired eyes of someone who'd seen every trick in the book. He reviewed the documents with professional disinterest while both sides made their opening arguments. Pritchard's lead attorney, a woman named Chloe Brennan, was sharp and ruthless. Your Honor, the plaintiff is attempting to use forged documents, hidden conveniently in a wall and discovered only when facing foreclosure, to make a fraudulent claim on property that has been legally owned and managed by Pritchard Development for over a century. This is a transparent attempt at extortion. Ava responded with controlled fury. Your Honor, these documents are authentic historical records proving that land was never legally sold. Pritchard Development's ownership is based on a fraudulent transaction from 1891, and we have evidence to prove it. What evidence? Judge Hendricks asked. This was the moment. Ava pulled out her briefcase. We found the original sale record Pritchard Development is basing their claim on. It's dated March 15, 1891, and it shows Marcus Webb selling 300 acres in Louisville to Harrison Pritchard for $3,000. Pritchard's attorneys looked smug, but Ava wasn't finished. We also found Marcus Webb's death certificate. He died on January 7, 1891, 2 months before this sale supposedly took place. The courtroom went silent. Judge Hendricks sat forward. Explain. Someone forged Marcus Webb's signature on that sale document. Harrison Pritchard, Logan Pritchard's great-grandfather, essentially stole that land from a dead man's family. The documents Mr. Webb found in his wall are the original deeds Marcus hid before he died, probably because he suspected Harrison Pritchard was going to try exactly this kind of fraud. Chloe Brennan was on her feet. This is speculation. We need forensic analysis of both documents. Already done, Ava said, sliding reports across to the judge. 3 independent forensic analysts examined the signatures. The sale document is a forgery. The deeds in Mr. Webb's possession are authentic. Carter watched Judge Hendricks read the reports. The old man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Mr. Pritchard, the judge said quietly, your great-grandfather committed fraud. Logan Pritchard stood. Your Honor, even if that's true, and I'm not conceding it is, we're talking about events from 1891. My family has held that property in good faith for over a century. The statute of limitations doesn't apply to fraud, Judge Hendricks interrupted. And it certainly doesn't apply when the rightful owner never knew about the theft. He looked at Carter. Mr. Webb, this property legally belongs to you. I'm ruling in your favor. The words didn't feel real. Carter sat frozen while Ava gripped his arm, while reporters rushed from the courtroom, while Pritchard's attorneys erupted in objections. Judge Hendricks banged his gavel. This court is adjourned, Mr. Webb. Those deeds are yours. Do with them what you will. 2 months later, Carter stood in the same barn, but everything was different. The roof had been completely replaced. New stalls lined the walls. Marcus and the two foals, which he'd named Justice and Hope at Ava's suggestion, occupied the largest stall, warm and well-fed. The property settlement with Pritchard Development had been finalized. Carter couldn't keep all the Louisville land. Some had been legally developed over the years, with structures built by people who had no knowledge of the fraud. But the undeveloped portions, the properties that still sat vacant, those came back to him. The total value, $18 million. He'd sold most of it immediately, kept one parcel for himself, a future project he hadn't defined yet. The money had saved the farm, allowed him to hire help, rebuild everything that had fallen apart. But it was more than money. It was vindication, proof that sometimes, impossibly, things could turn around. Ava had become more than his attorney. She'd become a friend, stopping by weekly to check on him and the horses. Riley came by too, helping Carter plan a proper horse rescue operation he wanted to start on the property. "You ever figure out where they came from?" Riley asked one evening, watching Marcus in his stall. "Nobody ever reported them missing." Carter shook his head. "Best guess? Someone abandoned them during the storm, like you said. Marcus must have seen the light in my house and headed for it. And he just happened to pour at exactly the wall where those deeds were hidden. Coincidence. He probably smelled moisture or rot in that wall." Riley gave him a skeptical look. "You really believe that?" Carter looked at Marcus, the massive horse who'd wandered into his life during the worst night of it, who'd somehow known exactly where to search, who'd given him back his family's legacy. The truth was, he didn't know what he believed, but it didn't matter. "I believe he needed help," Carter said quietly. "And I believe I needed him. Everything else is just details." Outside, the sun was setting over fields that would be green again come spring. The foreclosure notice had been burned in the fireplace. The barn stood solid and strong, and 3 abandoned horses had a home where they would never be hungry or cold again. Sometimes, Carter thought, the most incredible thing wasn't what happened. It was being brave enough to open your door when hope came knocking, even if it arrived on 4 hooves in the middle of a storm.